Welcome to our third version of Quarantime. This is an experiment that began about 11 days ago. 11 days is when San Francisco first went on to its lockdown. It's day 11 of a world where we're physically isolated, but evolving in real time the kind of tools that we're using to maintain physical distance, but establish intimacy and connection and link our networks, our innovation spaces, and our communities in a moment of pandemic response. We kind of came up with this idea of quarantine because we realized that we were disconnected and needed to kind of understand what was going on. There was a real need to know what's going on here. Our first show was really focused on pandemic response. We spent some time with Andrew Hessel, who is a synthetic biologist, looking at how that community is responding. Last time, we looked at the whole bottoms-up response nature of this. We called that show The Commander Is Us, and it was the realization that at a time when things move so quickly all over the world, it's tough to get a top-down response, even more so when you have a national government that doesn't quite catch on to what exponential problems look like. And we looked last time at everything from how maker spaces are responding to kind of how the scientific community is responding. One of the issues that came up in last week's show and something that, or Wednesday's show just 2 days ago, and something that I'm seeing across the community is 11 days into this, conversations are almost bimodal. There are people who are very concerned with the response today, more masks, more protective devices. And then there are a bunch of people who are thinking about, boy, when this ends, it's going to be like Reconstruction. And we're going to face very new problems, but more importantly, we've looked right into the headlines of what a complex global problem looks like, a systems problem, an exponential problem, and that requires kind of different thinking coming out of it. And one of the tensions on the show last time was, well, like, do we focus on the immediate or do we focus on the long term? And that's what today's show is about. Each of our guests, it turns out, are both struggling with this and have a very strong response. We'll start today with Alexander Rosen, who runs the Long Now Foundation. Alexander Rosen's foundation is really about long-term thinking, and has been kind of in the middle of this stuff for years. We're going to then talk to Nicol Bradford, whose transformational technology lab at Stanford is very much in the middle of this, and she wrote a piece earlier this week about Team Now and Team Next. Joining us then will be our good friend Ting Jiang at the Center for Advanced Hindsight. She's a behavioral scientist, and when we talk about getting behavior change at scale, we need to use everything we know about behavioral economics to run experiments and do that really quickly. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the future of cities and move on to the role of the arts in all of this. That's today's program. But let's start with Alexander Rose. Welcome, Alexander.
Hey, good to see you.
There was an article today in The Atlantic that said it wasn't just Trump who got it wrong. America's response failed because we didn't understand the complexity of the problem. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the ideas behind the long now and how you both take a long-term view and you promote systems thinking, a way of thinking that itself is longer term than the immediate, and why that long-term view may be so important in the middle of a crisis.
Yeah, well, I think there's definitely two angles to this. One is this longer-term thinking, where when you look at anything like an asteroid impacts or large market crashes or a pandemic, earthquakes, tsunamis, all of these things are 100% guaranteed to happen. They are not black swan events. They are. We know they are going to happen. The only thing we don't know is when, and the real variable is how we actually prepare for them. And generally, the shorter the interval, the better effect that people have in their planning. So countries that saw recent SARS outbreaks or more recent SARS outbreaks have been much better at planning than other ones. taking a step back, just the Long Now Foundation's main goal is to get people to think long term and to find things that are worth thinking long term about, and this certainly fits in that category.
As an organization, by the way, you yourself must be changing. This is an organization that was based on convening people and innovation. How is the Long Now responding in this moment where we've all gone virtual, and kind of what does that imply for the kind of programming you have coming up?
Yeah, well, I mean, we were founded really with projects around information science and building a 10,000-year clock as a kind of icon for long-term thinking. But in more recent years, have certainly been doing a lot of events. We do, 30 plus public events a year, ranging from 50 people to 1,800 people. And that community that we built up is a really great one. And I think it's right now we're going into experimental mode, just like you are, and trying to figure out ways to connect that community. So we have canceled or put off all our current live events, but we're now moving to a virtual format, just as you are. We are looking at restarting that series that we were gonna have the next one of our main series on March 31st, and now that's going to be on April 16th with Jane Metcalf talking about synthetic biology.
Jane's talk, she's created this whole new media company around the future of biology. Boy, everything anyone was having to say 3 weeks ago certainly gets updated now. Speaking of a while ago, over New Year's, you published a very interesting piece by Danny Hillis. He talked about moving from the Enlightenment age to the entanglement age. The Enlightenment age was all about rational response, kind of linear thinking. Governments of the Enlightenment age, by their nature, were deliberate and slow. That's where democracy, our kind of representative democracy, came from. But now we're in this exponential age where if we see a problem, we need very fast kind of global responses immediately. And we're seeing now a movement towards things like we need lots of surveillance, lots of real-time data, and we need to have fast policy responses, almost like the Congress today with trillions of dollars. Can you lend us some of the Long Now thinking on what that phase change is? Because it looks like we're entering an era where our old precepts and ways we, philosophy, ways we look at government actually is failing us. And I think the organization has an insight into how we approach this.
Yeah, well, this idea of where things in the old world used to be very linear in the sense that you could kind of predict them as fairly linear systems, but now things are with so much interconnectedness in everything that we have in our lives that something like the supply chain for something as simple as N95 masks. When we see a global strain on them, they just kind of crumble because of how many interconnected leaves they have, and so we're seeing that in spades right now. And there's obviously just not when everything's optimized for just-in-time delivery, when it's optimized for people only having enough things on their shelves for the present moment, for kind of economic efficiency. When it comes to pandemic efficiency, they're all the wrong things that we've been optimizing for. So I think you start to see a lot of fragility in these systems that we would have thought as this kind of consumerist superpower that just getting something like enough masks would not be a problem, but we're seeing that it truly is.
Right, we're really seeing that. Right, we built a system that wasn't that resilient and was fragile. It kind of operated inside of a bound of constraints. If a lot of people are saying if we only rolled back a few weeks and the U.S. picked up the signals from China better, we'd be better off. But part of this sounds like the way we structured the efficient economy really isn't designed for these challenges. And I guess my final question here before we kind of move on is, how are we doing in kind of infusing this kind of thinking more broadly? Because it strikes me that when you say small inputs bring about big outputs, which is what happens in systems thinking and global change, that's exactly the kind of thing that conservatives don't like to hear.
Yeah, well, I would say that we're at a critical moment where we're in the middle of one of these long, interval events, and when you're in them, nobody wants to think long term because they're thinking about the next move. But obviously, the after action report of something like this is where the real juice is. And again, going back to countries that went through SARS, they kind of did an after action report, and they were set up in a way to handle this in a vastly better way than all the other countries. And the trick, I think, is, how do you get this kind of near-term response in civilization when the cycles may be hundreds or thousands of years, even though the results can be, catastrophic.
Our co-host Mickey McManus is joining us with a question. Hi, Mickey.
Hey, Peter. Hey, Xander. How you doing? When I visited the Interval Cafe, and you just mentioned we're in an interval moment right now, one of the interesting points was that you made about planting trees many, many centuries ago so that they were ready now. Can you tell us that story so that we have a sense of kind of an example of long-term thinking, or the long now that you're talking about, this sort of pace layer idea?
Yeah, that was yes. Actually, I think possibly a more appropriate story, but in the same vein, is actually that of the from the last tsunami in Japan. When that happened, that was the tsunami level was considered a once in 10,000 year event. But they had, or I guess the earthquake was a once in 10,000 year event. The tsunami was a once in several century event. But one of the things they found after that were these stone markers that were placed at certain elevations around Japan, and they were marked with things like high places are the safe havens of our descendants. Please do not build below this line. And people built below that line. And it turned out some of these markers were as old as 400 years old. And so this kind of reminding of civilization, and that was kind of the sad story where people did build below that line, but there was another one where there was a hilltop, like a slight rise that people had congregated at in a tsunami also several centuries ago, and on that hilltop has been a marker that says don't come here in a tsunami, because it had a funny effect of funneling water around it and then actually killing the people that went to that high point. And that one was successful, and that became part of local legendary lore that you don't go to this particular high place during a tsunami, and people didn't run to it, and it I suspect saved many lives.
So you mentioned this, and I remember the author of the Optimist Telescope was at one of your recent talks, and you featured her, and that's a book we should add to our list. But it was this notion that there was actually a person who built a different nuclear reactor, who was being celebrated because he unfortunately has passed away, but he built the nuclear reactor in Japan such that he actually thought more deeply about the sort of scale that it could happen, because we just never had data from these kind of tsunami and earthquake events. And people who went to that nuclear reactor actually were perfectly fine. And they were actually safe, and they were kind of celebrating him for his longer term kind of point of view on engineering, because we basically just didn't have the data, and it's almost like a black swan event. And
yeah, actually, I mean the data was roughly there. I think the how well they believed in it was not. Again, there's these markers that had been ignored because there hadn't been a tsunami at that scale for several centuries. So in a way, they kind of had better data than just about anybody else had. He was the one who believed in it, and there was a few cases like that where a seawall was put up by a governor who was, he had been a mayor or a governor of that area for like 6 decades or something, and he pushed and pushed and pushed on getting a seawall put in that everyone thought was absurd. And he died before the tsunami happened, and then basically the tsunami waters like lapped just over the top of it and saved the whole town. There's a lot of these stories that were kind of largely unreported.
And is this just a relationship between, like, there is actually very valid theory and empirical data, but we're not very excited by that stuff. Like, we're excited by the shiny that leads. And we don't really participate in this longer term thinking. We didn't talk about this a little bit, but one of the art projects that you've been very focused on is the Long Now clock, and it can't work unless humans are a part of it, I think. Do I understand this correctly, or can you give us a sentence on that?
Yes, and then we're actually going to come back to the role of art and time. That's what the end of today's show is about. So maybe we should just hold that. But we have an artist lined up working with Long Now. There's treats to come. And gentlemen, also,
very good. All right, tease.
Moment, because when we talk about how we approach planning our communities and cities, once the smoke clears from this, we'll have a live exercise on this. I want to bring up next our friend Nicol Bradford. Nicol runs the Transformative Technology Lab at Stanford, and she's been working at the confluence of human flourishing and well-being. And just a few months ago, Mickey and Ting and I and Nicol started thinking through how we can make cities a font for flourishing and we'll get into a little bit of that. But Nicol, this week you started meditating on the now and the next, and I wanted you to share with us a little bit about what you've written, and also the kind of practices that you've put into your life, because our lives, all of the markers we use for how we do our, we go to work, we go to the gym, we come home, we go to dinner, we go, that's all gone. And we almost are recreating this from scratch. So maybe you can walk us from personal practice and then how you're thinking of how we connect to the world.
Sure. Yeah. So, the premise of the Transformative Technology Lab is that we can and should leverage all of the exponential technologies to further explore the inner landscape. So to get better at having mental and emotional well-being, which we see as a skill, stress, anxiety, light depression, happiness, sleep, all of these things, that the more that you know about them and some basic skills puts you in a much better place. And then for what we call social and emotional flourishing, so self-awareness, emotional self-regulation, human interaction skills, and then another category is human excellence, which is really tied to purpose and meaning and cognition and emotional enhancement. And so, our premise is that all of this, that we could and should, and it's probably one of the most noble uses of technology there is, to help humans understand themselves better. And so that is the purpose of the lab. What my personal practice has been is I've really upped my meditation and my exercise. And I actually, bought a Peloton several weeks before all of this started. And so I'm just, getting a lot of mileage in on that. And also sleeping, drinking a lot of water. There's basic things that can help one manage stress, and definitely the meditation. Where the article came from is that I'm in a chat group. I'm in a group called the British American Project, and it's a wonderful group of people. It's people in the U.S., all across the U.S., and in the UK. And there are several people in the group who I now call frontliners. And the frontliners are the people who are either healthcare practitioners in some way or directly supporting someone like that, the quote unquote essential armies, all the people who, from the Amazon warehouse people to the delivery people, like every person that's making it possible for the population to stay home. All of those people are heroic, even though it mostly focuses on the healthcare workers. And then also the government people. It's like the mayors. One of the people, many of these people are public servants across the United States and also in Europe, and many of them are also healthcare workers. And so in the chat, as they were talking about their day-to-day experiences while they were trying to get things under control, it's a wonderful, really supportive group. I had this day where I was like, oh, I don't have those skills. I'm not a nurse. I'm not a doctor. And I don't currently work in government. What can I do? And then I started thinking, well, I can't actually do something right now other than help flatten the curve by staying home. But maybe I can do something about what's next. Because it's also been our premise with transformative tech that, for the future of work and all of the things that are coming, it really is the social, it's the social fluidity, the social emotional intelligence that's actually going to be the next set of skills and the next things that people need. And so that's we've been talking about. So those two things together sort of came in to sort of like we're all on Team Human for the first time, ever really. We have something that we are all experiencing. Even during some of the greats in the past, sometimes they were regional a bit, or certain segments of the population. Maybe it was something that was affecting, just poor people, or this is something everyone and every child over 6. Every child old enough to remember anything is going to remember this moment. And so, it really also started making me think about what do we call it? Because if you think about it, if language is the human OS, I feel like what we call it is going to, it's more than descriptive. I think it will influence what we learn from it and how we leverage it. It has to be honest, but I think it should be directional. I have no idea what it is, though I did collect a list of it, which I prepared to share.
Yes,
so that's
go
sort
ahead.
of the overall.
A list of possible because I imagine we could frame this as a disaster, or we could frame this as a coming together and the beginning of something. It's either the end of something, or it's what are the kinds of things that you're hearing and coming up with?
Well, I put it on all of my social, asking the question, saying, what should we call this?
Yeah.
And part of the reason for this is because we are meaning making machines. What we call it is a big part of how I think we'll respond to it. And it was also really interesting to see who called it what, and as I saw people post, you could definitely see personality types tied to different terminologies, but some of them, I'll just read some of them, because I was like, well, and I put it as the great blank, like, what do we call this? And so some of them have been the great experiment, time to pause, the collective pause, the great rally, the great reset, the great leveling, the great equalizer, the great paralysis, the great infection, the global evolution, the great reinvention, the great cessation, the great realization, the pandemic of 2020, the realignment, the great realignment, the great transition, the great shift, the great grounding, the big reset, the great change, the age of compassion, the lost spring, the slow plague, the invisible war, the great endure, the great grief,
Great endure.
Yeah. The great oneness, the great reckoning, the end of decadence, the great pause, the great adaptation, the universal time out, the great purification, and the great awakening.
I think you may have just shared with us one of the first pieces of pandemic poetry that we've had yet.
I should do it as a spoken word.
Yeah. What's interesting about that is almost all of those understand that it's some discontinuous phase change, right? Like it's not like in the 1918 flu. I'm not sure what they were saying in the middle, but we recognize that was like a really bad pandemic. And then we kind of moved on with the 1920s. The war was over, and we did what we were supposed to do. Like we just continued linearly with what American society was supposed to be. This does not feel like that. Gets back to what Alexander was saying earlier, and probably why we're so curious about this and why we have this discontinuous between what's now and what's next. We're going to come back to you in a moment when we talk a little bit about what's next for cities. I want to bring up our friend Ting Jiang from the Center for Advanced Hindsight. Many of you may know this as Dan Ariely's Behavioral Science, Behavioral Economics Lab at Duke. Ting, behavioral science is all about using science to run experiments to understand what changes our behavior. Now, famously, gamification and Facebook changed our behavior and led to certain things that we could talk about in another conversation. But in a way, this seems to be your team's moment, because never before have we had to change so much behavior at scale. And the math of this says if we don't change like lots of people's behavior all at once, the whole social distancing thing doesn't work. So perhaps share with us a little bit about how you're approaching this and some of the experiments that you're running. And I think so many people that are interested in bringing about change are really interested in what the scientists of change have to say right now.
Thank you, Peter. This is indeed a very exciting time. And what we know from behavioral science is that people actually have a lot of intuitions about what can drive behavior that are actually wrong, right? So when we think about, eating better, exercise more, a lot of people would focus on, what people don't know and sort of educate them instead of thinking about habit change or behavior that are really kind of more automatic. And it turns out that our behavior are much more automatic than we actually imagine. So when we think about behavioral change related to hand washing, it's really not sufficient that people just realize that it's important, but also important for us to leverage the scientific findings on how to actually help ourselves get the habits in place more effectively. So in just this past week, first of all, we were fortunate to collaborate with social media, and they ended up running our study within a period of 7 days. And I think it was great for us too, because they were able to reach, even 5,000 people within 4 hours in terms of collecting the data. And so we had this kind of beautiful example of embedding science into sort of how we design the video, as well as, data collection. But at the same time, they help us reach out the most people possible for collecting the baseline data, but also for introducing the interventions that actually include the science in it.
Go ahead.
So we're actually going to collaborate with the national TV program for the elderly, about 50 years old in the Netherlands. And again, actually going to 6 weeks interventions called Keeping the Rhythm, to help them keep up with their well-being. Because as we know, also, as Nicol pointed out, there's the team now and team next, and a lot of us actually in the team next. And how can we actually make sure that we take care of our mental health, physical health, so that we don't actually burden necessarily the healthcare, right? So really help increase our immunity. And immune system is really amazingly important at this point, especially given how stress and anxiety, as we know, is shown to actually hurt immunity. So we are going to actually randomize people who watch this TV program into different using different tactics to help them, become more successful in, say, exercise or sleeping better. And we're gonna helpfully quickly learn what is the most effective for this population, and then roll out and scale up those interventions. So we're extremely excited about that. But of course, this special period, it requires us to kind of get everything ready with like 10 times the speed that we usually do. But that's we have to kind of deal with it a little bit with our own sort of sleeping and stress and anxiety. But that's it's very exciting at the moment.
I know you've brought with you today some examples of some of the experiments that you've run and some slides. So I'd love you to take us through a little bit of the background. And I think this is probably especially useful because so many people now are trying to get people to take actions. Even the bug on the bottom of our screen, stay home, save lives. We put a lot of effort into getting that message out. And then the great question is, what are the things that actually change behavior? So share this with us. And Mickey, why don't you join us? And the three of us can then talk a little bit about behavior change at scale. Ting, show us what you got here.
Yeah, sounds good. So it turns out there's such a thing as breaking points. And I want to use this particular example because I think stress and anxiety is really not productive. At the moment, if we think about like even 1 billion people, if we have 1 hour of stress and anxiety or those trigger kind of behavior of overreading on news, it can not only kind of hurt our mental health, physical health, but also productivity. So if you go to the next slide, what is this? What is breaking points? It's when you feel you can no longer hold back and you reward yourself for all the stress and deprivation you experience with food, drink, smoking, alcohol, drugs, and other unhealthy behavior. So we have, our center has done a very interesting study correlating the phenomenon of breaking points to diabetes. And we found that above other things, it predicts a lot on actually diabetic health. So when people were asked, when I'm in a bad mood, how likely I'm going to engage in this unhealthy behavior versus healthy behavior, people who reported having breaking points are much more likely to indulge in the unhealthy behavior. And we have 50% of this population who are diabetic actually having breaking points than not having breaking points. And so if you look at the healthy behavior, so the people who don't have breaking points versus those who have, they don't have any differences, right? So, and if you go, I'll go to the next slide. So informing people about what behavior matters or diet, all of those did not predict the diabetic behavior. So breaking points is something that predicts even more than years of disease of how long you have had it.
And breaking point, it's empirical. It's like people who simply have a point at which they shift from one behavior to another. It shows you the
when they feel that they are out, they cannot control the situation, and they need to rely on, for example, unhealthy snacking, or maybe I jump on social media because it gives me this immediate gratification for me to cope with the stress and anxiety, right? So in this period of time, any kind of stress and anxiety is going to trigger us to actually procrastinate on doing the most important thing, most productive thing, because we need to calm our psychology. So like Nicol said, all the meditation, all those are actually making sure that we stay focused on what is important instead of, social hurting or kind of all of this unhealthy behavior that would potentially not just even not getting us to be in a healthier outcome, but also potentially really.
Ting, I've got a question for you. I mean, I think earlier you said there's this gap between motivation and behavior, or motivation and habit.
Right.
And it's almost like we keep, and you just said, informing people about, if you're going to hit a breaking point, it doesn't actually work, because that's kind of like trying to work on the motivation side.
Exactly.
But tell me a little bit about I mean, how do we actually help people with better habits, or how do we kind of push in that direction? If a lot of people are like, let's put the bug up. It says stay home, save lives. That'll work. We inform people. But informing, and it goes back to your first comment, which is we don't actually have very good instincts about how our brain works. There's a gap between behavior and habits. It's really hard to put a new habit in place.
Absolutely. And if Omid can help me show the brain part, so just to maybe we can jump ahead. And this, by the way, it shows how much people's understanding about risk. So if you go to the next slide, people's understanding about how much risk diabetic health is to their long-term health had no influence on whether they follow the diet advice or exercise advice. That's exactly what you said. Yeah, telling them it's bad, it doesn't help. What is really helping? So for example, even on no touching face kind of advice or hand washing, no touching face. Imagine you put a little sticker next to your computer. Don't touch your face. right? So that's kind of bringing kind of salience to your mind, because whenever you do that, you actually have no idea that you are doing that. In fact, a lot of us are touching faith just as we speak, and I think we don't realize
I'm doing
that.
it all the time, apparently. Yeah.
Yeah. So in your daily environment, making sure that your choice we call it choice architecture, is basically the architecture where where you make your choice are most supportive to your automatic response, right? So using reminder cues. And for example, for a new habit, and as we know, actually, this is a great opportunity for acquiring new habits as well, because of the context change.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Because as we know, when we travel, we also drop our good habits, but it's also a good time, when we don't feel as much to actually do the old habits, typically because the cues are not there, right? So how can we set up these cues in our environment to put all of your healthy snacks in the, next to your computer, since you are also working much more next to your computer now. Make it very salient. Hide all your unhealthy snacks. So this would be a great one. If it's
So
a
you're
new
talking
habit,
about almost an architecture, and you mean literally like the things outside of our brain impact us more than we think. We're shaped by the environment. If we could put our healthy snacks by the computer, we're going to go grab for them. And someone on our LinkedIn feed mentioned that BJ Fogg talks quite a lot about this at Stanford, is that notion of how do we shape our environment, because a lot more decisions happen that are outside of us, but we actually think that they're in our brain.
Yeah, I want to give two quick more examples on this. One is, for example, consistent cues is very important for habit formation. We would typically recommend people don't put their yoga mat, don't roll it out. Don't try to be neat. Put it in your living room and leave it there, so that every time you see it, you can actually get yourself to it, right? So Wendy Wood, who wrote this Good Habits, Bad Habits, she actually wear her exercise clothes as pajamas, so that in the morning when she get out of bed, she got cued to actually do the exercise. If we, for example, now, if we kind of end up every morning over reading on the stats, we know the stats, just spend 5 minutes, check on the stat, and then just get on your most important.
Get out of
if
it.
we fail to, if we fail to do that, we could kind of set an intention of saying, hey, whenever I am reading on news, on the time that I don't plan to read on news, do a push-up, or do a jumping jack, so piggyback a sort of healthy habit to a kind of a punishment, not as a punishment, but it's a healthy punishment. But it also helps you create awareness of your own deviation.
So much of us, we sort of just wander through life, and we think we're making the decisions, but really the world is shaping us so much. I mean, from Herb Simon, the Nobel-winning economist, who talks about our brains are like, our mind is like a pair of scissors. One blade is the brain, but the other blade is the environment we push against. And so if you can't change the person, change the environment. You just had the graphic of the type 1, the type 2 brain, sort of Kahneman and Tversky understanding that the type 1 is kind of like a lizard brain. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Right. And this is actually almost accounting for 70% of our decisions daily were made by the system 1, which is very automatic, we're very reactive. And I think the very beautiful sort of insight is that we actually underestimate how much decisions are made in that. And so sometimes we tend to also over-blame ourselves for failure in behavior. And as we know, when we feel bad about, ourselves, we actually tend to kind of go away from that. I mean, that's why people procrastinate on the most important thing. We are afraid of the failure. And so I think a very helpful one is also to have absolute 100% compassion about the imperfections of our behavior, and sort of leave some of it to scientific experts or the environmental setup to help us do it better. But whenever you fail, just remember that it's the automatic side of the brain. It's really not that you intentionally are meant to not be that perfect sort of behavioral outcome, and nobody do, including behavioral scientists ourselves. So I think it's really up to policymakers and also people who have the possibility of designing both digital and physical space to give now the more science-informed sort of strategies on behavioral change.
Yeah. Let's get away from the sort of it feels good or it sounds right, it's science-y, scientism versus actual science. And it seems like, your whole team at Duke, it's a Center for Advanced Hindsight because in a sense, hindsight's 2020. Like, we're really good at looking backwards and we try to post facto rationalize this. But your point is we actually have myopia towards the future. We're not so good with ourselves when we look forward, and we make bad decisions because our lizard brain is like, it's the sort of cheapest consumption of sugar is the quick reaction stuff. And I drove for an hour. I don't remember it.
You also see this at scale when we're confronted with a problem we haven't had before, right? So, I mean, you see this in all of his oddness aside, in President Trump going from one day listening to science and then the next day to a gut, right? And also, I want one more question before we move on. This whole bit about social distancing, of which it comes from science, and there's a particular math that says that when does the clock reset, and you don't have to be around a whole lot of people to screw up all the time you put into social distancing. But in many ways, we're kind of running that a bit by our gut, and I'm wondering where behavior change can come into that. I'll give you one example. We have a group called Distance Resistance. It's really about how do we maintain connections at social distance. And a friend recently yesterday, remember we're about day 11, day 11 here, and I noticed kind of all at once people were getting udgy, and people were like, "Can we go out? Can we go visit our friends? Can we go visit our friends who've been quarantining?" And like all at once yesterday, this was in a lot of people's minds, and I got an invitation to a short 6-footer. A short 6-footer would be a small 6-footer, a small party where we'd be 6 feet apart on a roof. And I'm like, is this a good idea or not? And so I put it out to the team, and basically everybody beat up on me and said, that's the worst idea we ever heard of. But it reminds me of what you said earlier, that, you have people who hit a breaking point and who don't. And my guess is right now, the riskiest breaking point behavior, other than like snacking and where the yoga mat is this whole behavior about, do you go out? And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on mass behavior change to get people to do what we need them to do to flatten the curve.
Yeah, great question. I think 3 quick insights. One, it's a norm change. And we know such a thing as pluralistic ignorance, because we have certain beliefs about other people's expectations. We tend not to actually do a reality check because it's embarrassing to us. And we sometimes are actually feeling more pressure from other people to behave certain ways. So in a way, when other people ask us to meet them, it's so much harder to say no than not asking other people. So that's also realizing that and being aligned on that, I think it could be helpful. The other is making sure that the online social connection is fun, right? So find a way to connect with others. So we were actually playing some conversation, no small talk conversation game with our friends, and we make sure that was a very fun way to connect. We have drinks and sort of good laughs. It was meant to be an hour. We ended up doing 3 hours. We felt like just in the same room. So making sure that it was as rewarding so that people feel less temptation to actually get together. And then the third is planning ahead of how do you cope with when the self-control issue actually emerge. So think ahead. What would you do when you're actually feeling tempted to want to meet with someone? Find a very rewarding substitute for it, and have that strategy written out and put it on your fridge or put it somewhere kind of salient. And maybe even tell your friends about it. This is my strategy of socializing with you or coping with that. So I would say these 3 things would be maybe a good start. But also, I think it would be great if we can use experimentation to test out what is more successful and not, and make sure that we iterate on these strategies and have evidence backing, because a lot of these contexts have not been studied in science before. So if we can actually run studies in this particular context and show which one actually has the biggest success, that would be also wonderful.
Let's move now from this focus on the immediate and go a little long term. I'd like to invite Nicol and Alexander back. And Nicol, you and Ting and myself and Mickey came together when you had your transformative technology conference a few months ago, and we were thinking about how can the physical form of the city drive uh, happier behavior, healthier behavior. And we gave a bunch of examples, things that we've done at Gray Area that drove people to come together in space. And Mickey showed examples of buildings that measure how you behave and can respond. And it strikes me that right now, the furthest thing from our heads is the return to civic life. And yet at some point, we're going to go back out, get back together. And I think the world's going to be a little bit different. So maybe you might set the table a little bit for the conference that we were planning in Singapore that'll happen virtually, and then we can talk a little bit about how we're going to when we reemerge into civic life. Let's talk a little bit about how things might be different and how we can apply these technologies both to keep ourselves safe and also to create more inclusiveness.
Awesome. Yeah, the way that you framed that just really made me think of it like this. It's that a city is a lot of things, but a city also represents an aggregation of humanity. Like there's lots of people in cities. And so when one is thinking about, this new context, there's actually something like, because what started me down the city path was realizing that while the academy had well-being and flourishing measures for individuals, there were some people who were starting to do them for companies, which are essentially clusters of individuals, that there just really hadn't been a lot of work that was done yet on, millions and millions of humans together, which is also often known as a city. And so while we were talking a little bit earlier, and we were talking about, Ting's comment about how stress and anxiety keeps you from making good choices, and a conversation that you and I had yesterday about this being that there being a reconstruction on the other side of that, or a public works on the other side of that, and a New Deal on the other side of that. It just made me think about two things. One, it's sort of like there's, what is and I know lots of people disagree with the New Deal and have comments on what they think it did, but like, what is the digital version of that? And, and I realized while you were talking is that, what drew me to cities was actually the concept of aggregated flourishing for humanity, and what would that look like? And so that actually means that theoretically you could actually, have it partially physical and partially digital. It doesn't have to be, only physical. And so in this interim time, and then also in sort of like the age that's coming, maybe there is a mix and a blend as we sort of like rethink what our civic space looks like. It's a new thought. So this is like, it's really raw. It just came about on this call.
Alexander, so many of the people who come through the Long Now think a lot about cities. I think of Jeffrey West's pointing out that cities are organisms that hugely survive, but also it's tough to get us to think exponentially. Jim Fallows came by recently and talked about infrastructure in cities. And I think one of the opportunities here is, as we come out of this, what do we do differently in terms of instrumenting cities around happiness, but also do we have to be prepared to do things differently, because what the nature of assembly looks like might be a little bit different. Like, are we going to be leery coming out of this? Are we going to want to have measurements on ourselves to understand who we're around? How does kind of our long-term thinking inform what might be next for how we're going to approach, instrumenting or preparing our civic space?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, cities are, our longest lived institutions that we have. I mean, you look at cities like Jericho with, continuous habitation for on the order of 8,000 to 10,000 years. And they're obviously living organisms. They have things that change and don't change even when there's massive destruction and wars that go through them. Things like the street layouts almost never change, even while the buildings between those blocks do. And I do think there's there's so many compounding positive cultural effects that that happen in cities. And I remember in our conversations with Jeffrey West, who studied those compounding positives for so long, it's like, well, what is the one force that could stop the this urbanization trend? And of course, the topic that came up was pandemics. And we've seen it in the past with the Black Plague, where people emptied the cities for quite a while. And it took and I think it speaks to this current trend right now. Not so much that everyone's like totally emptying the city. Certainly, I know a lot of people who, if they have a home that they can go to that is not in a city, that seems to be where they're sheltering in place. So we're already seeing it on some level. And I think there's going to be different versions of success and failure with that when, you have people who are rushing to their vacation towns that have no hospital resources, for instance. And when a disease that can only be truly treated in an ICU with a ventilator, and you rush out to some small town that only has one ICU bed, you're not necessarily making yourself safe, but you might be making your chances of lower transmission greater. So I think that we're still seeing kind of failures of systems thinking, even among people who have the resources to move out of their cities. But on the longer term, the question is, you can turn on this kind of social distancing very fast, but the turning it off is going to be really tricky until there's like a totally proven and tested vaccine. We're going to stutter step our way out of this. And we're already seeing this with China, where people kind of want it to be done, and it's not. And people are getting reinfected. They're reclosing their borders to incoming traffic. And all of these things were learned in past pandemics. 1918 is famous for its recurring problem that happened where we had a spring situation like this. It went away in the summer, and then the most deadly time was the following fall.
Talk about compounding complex problems. Already before this, we had a crisis, say, here in San Francisco, of what you do with ground floor retail, right? All of our zoning is about you want to go to the local store and pick things up and confluence there. But now in the online world and with delivery, that's being abandoned, which means that street life is different. So we already had this crisis about retail space that was being abandoned. And leading into that, some of the work that we were doing at Gray Area on immersive place-based media and others was all about how do you create a new kind of third space if you're not out drinking or buying shoes. Well, all of a sudden, here's this crisis where people may not want to go out. And Nicole, you brought up language earlier. When we describe what's next, we often use the terms urban renewal or rebuilding, but I'm wondering if the word won't be more like reconstruction. We've not had a war on our soil really since the Civil War. And then we had Reconstruction in the South. And I'm wondering what metaphor we use and how we approach it, because if people are really leery of going out, that means they're going to be really leery of the economy that we have come from. And it's not just a problem for a few months. It's going to be a problem, I don't know, forever, how long it takes the culture to change. There's like
a trust problem. Hey, one comment maybe, and Nicole, if you've got some thoughts on that. But one comment from Alexander Rose, he mentioned Jeffrey West, and I think I'm also trying to keep the living whiteboard alive and think about kind of the further readings, further watchings. And you mentioned Jeffrey West from the Santa Fe Institute, right? And that's one example of an organization that has tried to take a very interdisciplinary approach and a very sort of different approach to complexity and think about complexity that we can't really think about it, just in one silo. We've actually got to work with people that don't think the same way as us. Ting doesn't think the same way as I do. She's a behavioral scientist. I'm a designer. I'm not even sure what she's saying sometimes, but the joy of it is trying to figure out how these things fit together and how to actually do this. And I would say for further readings, Jeffrey West's book Scale is very important. And it feels important because it talks about cities as organisms that have a different scaling law than organisms like a whale or a shrew, or than organizations. Cities are actually incredibly powerful in the way that they compress and they kind of increase the release of patents, the new IP that comes out, the the resiliency that comes from it is different than an organization or an organism. And so at some point, and I think what Nicol is focusing on is this notion of how do we take these minds and meaning, which comes from Ting and, the things about wellness and how we actually understand the social sciences, which are probably the hardest sciences of all, but we call them soft science and then we dismiss them. But we're just not good at them yet. It's very high dimensional. Those minds and meaning don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in a place. They exist in the corner store. They exist in the community you live in, the house you live in, and over this place where you find potential. And we have to probably balance, Peter's focused a lot on art and the gray area, but also science, this understanding that theory is important, as Ting brought up. Like, we could be real behavioral scientists. We could really think about this differently if we thought about science, but also art. Science is kind of the compressible, E equals MC squared. But art is the incompressible. Like, maybe the best scientific investigation for something about our inner lives is a novel like Middlemarch. It's not compressible. And we need to celebrate both, because in some ways the artists dabble on the edges. They take the weird technologies and they bend them and break them and do things. Nicol, did you have more you wanted to add just about the city side or what we do in terms of reconstruction? Or maybe Ting, it looks like you're raising your hand.
And I just want to point out that Nicol's institute has this great way of bringing tech into the picture as well. So science, tech, and art, right? And how tech can actually support science. And I just want to point out, in 20th century, we had this quantifiable self on well-being movement that did not actually take off, and partly because we didn't have those sensors that capture our data all the time. So if we think about like all the intangible values a human being has of happiness, a lot of those cannot be captured by the amount of money and status we have. And how do we capture those kind of intangible values? It was and if you have a way of measuring, then you can actually run even self-experimentation, scientifically evolve it. But because back then having sensors and capturing your heartbeat and everything would be so expensive, so it became a dream that didn't get realized in 20th century, which is much more feasible and possible now in 21st century. So I'm also curious about if Nicol has something to say.
And give us a comment here. Then we're going to move on to an arts conversation, and I just want to let everybody know we're obviously going to run a little bit long, so we may go to 90 minutes. We'll be coming up with a really interesting conversation in just a few seconds on the arts and science. So Nicol, give us your thought on that, and then we'll kind of put you guys back in the green room, move on to arts, and then come back together again for questions a little bit later. So go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think the net of it also is I think the other thing that challenged those early movements wasn't just the extent to which sensors were available. I think really it seems like change is really tied to, like, people don't actually change until their story about themselves finally changes. And so that goes back to what is the narrative? It goes back to what are we going to call this thing if we want it to be directional and not just descriptive? And I have this feeling that what we call it is going to really influence how we respond to it and whether or not it is a big change for us or not. And so I think what we've really seen, the products that we really see have the greatest effect on people are ones that have humans in the loop mixed with technology. So there is a human, they don't have to be in the same room, but there is a human who is helping you use the technology to ultimately change. And what I think is happening, which I don't actually know, this is just my intuition right now, is I think that the moment where we change our story about ourselves, I think that that's tied to other human beings. And so I think, whatever the digital New Deal looks like, the blend between, digital and physical, and what does, aggregated city scale flourishing look like, it's going to have a lot to do with humans plus tech plus narrative changes and story changes. When I first posted that thing saying, what do we call it? Someone's like, it's a little early to brand it. And I was like, that's very surface. That's not what this is about. And I don't think we'll have the title for it anytime soon, but whatever it ends up being is really going to affect how it changes us and how we change with it.
And at this moment, in the middle of a phase change, when things are complex and we need new narrative, it's probably the artists that we turn to help us work through that. Um, and I want to have Jonathan Keats join us now. Uh, I got to know Jonathan when we were collaborating at the Gray Area for a very interesting show that we're going to get to in a moment that seemed incredibly prescient because it was a show on kind of the boundaries of the self, uh, humans and biology. We'll get to that in a moment. But Jonathan, the world of the arts, whether it's music or visual arts, has been completely upended because these are businesses that are about going out and being together. And you've written in Forbes a lot in just the last week on how museums are responding, on what virtual exhibitions look like, how businesses are changing. So can you share with us a little bit of what you're seeing on the arts landscape, both in terms of how institutions are responding and what we're seeing, and also how maybe perhaps artists are beginning to respond?
Arts institutions are really struggling because at all the answers, the real question came up. In other galleries have had online viewing rooms for some time now. Museums have had some sort of online content. And that's always been auxiliary. It's been an added what people might experience, been a teaser or perhaps a little business on the side. And now we're in a very different, literally, we're in our own homes. And suddenly what was auxiliary becomes central. I don't think that it is proving in its new position to be up to the problem, up to the challenges that we currently face, which is to say that I think it also is an enormous opportunity for us to think about what might happen that might go beyond effectively what was always. And I've been exploring this, as you mentioned, in a series of columns on but also more broadly have been doing so as a matter of my own research and my own work. And I think that fundamentally it is about in terms of what the museum is, what arts institutions are more broadly, in terms of what they do in, for, and with society. And I think that the arts are not the most central aspect of how it works at the level, are able to come to some sort of consensus in spite of differences. That culture is really what gets us there. And it happens to a large extent, as important as art's experience in isolation may be. And the novel is an incredibly powerful and important art. Much in the arts happens communally. And that no longer is for very obvious reasons. So I think that the central challenge of our time is to figure out, allow for that to happen, and how do we facilitate it, and how can arts institutions serve that purpose, and how can artists fit into it. And that's really been a lot of the exploration that I've been making, ranging from looking at how in the space-time continuum habit, time is the one part of it that we're able to inhabit together. So therefore live streaming is really happening and flourishing right now in terms of symphonies. That this is something in the museum context, which is being explored, but something that can be explored too, especially by way of performance art. Also, the fact that we're able to go outside, many of us still, and some countries, of course, this is restricted now, allows for art that is outdoors, for environmental art, for land art, that we can come together at a safe distance, that there is still space, even if not necessarily space as we ordinarily think about it. And then thirdly, thinking about this in terms of how things online in ways that are not necessarily based on time, but that are in the realm of interaction, and how the interactions that we customarily undertake as a matter of being together might be migrated online, what sort of precedents there are art, and what sort of potential there is in terms of new forms of art ever been needed in a sense, and that haven't ever been prompted.
You know, you make a very interesting point that the mechanism that kept us together in museums and concerts was place. And now that that's gone, something with a time stream that we can click into, right? That synchronization moment of when there's a scene or when we know the symphony's on, or that's probably why we're doing this show, right? What we're doing right now could have been a podcast, but there's something about the fact that we're talking live, comments are coming in live, that it's back to being a campfire, right? This is, and I mean, the good news is people who are closer to technology just swim in this stuff and evolve it. And it's bad news if you have an incredible collection of paintings and you're scrambling to figure out how to make it work in a window because, you know, Rubens didn't paint for a screen window, whereas gamers evolved a native form of art for screen. So, I mean, one thing we're seeing right now is like gaming is huge. The connected portion of gaming is huge. I'm sure we'll see new kind of forms of art come out of that pretty quickly, but kind of in a classic McLuhan sense, we've just thrown a crisis into traditional institutions. What are you seeing in terms of ways that artists are beginning to do new things or respond here? For example, are you seeing artists working with the data from the COVID? Are you seeing kind of new forms of applying, say, gaming and VR technology to it? Or has it been just too soon to see what's new?
I think that one thing that's been happening in very much of a triage sort of way has been trying to figure out how those more traditional art forms can survive in this environment. And specifically what I'm thinking of is the fact that it's getting toward graduation for a lot of BFA and MFA students who don't have now the opportunity to show their work in the way that traditionally they have, that is to say, in the physical galleries at the schools that they attend. And so one makeshift response to this has been a gallery that was created about a week ago or a week and a half ago called Social Distance Gallery. It's on Instagram, is a gallery where all these artists are able to show their work. And as a result of scale, because there are so many of them doing so, it brings, not literally of course, but it brings in of going to Instagram and looking at a lot more work than they otherwise would. So as a matter of audience and as a matter of crossing of paths, crossover of work, it's been an interesting experiment, not one that really was ever intended or really would ever
this is
for.
We're looking at it right now. This is I mean, what's interesting about this is of all of the needs to put up a gallery, here is one that's time-based, right? It's not just that the artist has an opening, it's these kids are graduating and everything they've been working for has been working towards the show. So I mean, if you scroll through that, and what the other fascinating thing about this gallery is it is across institutions, right? One institution created it, but basically if you have a portfolio and you're in art school and you are getting ready to do your presentation, here it is. This is kind of
it wasn't even one institution. It was one guy. It's this adjunct professor named Benjamin Cook who took it on himself. And I think that this improvisational way is really central to what is happening right now. And large arts institutions, which are indeed been estimated that something like 30% of them are not going to be able to reopen, and the Met is losing something like $100 million. But it's these smaller institutions, and specifically it's more in the realm of individual artists who have the lightness with which to be able to act in the moment need in order to be able to cope with a situation that changes literally not even every day, hour, or every minute. So this is of that kind of thing. I think that also you have these online spaces. So one possibility is in the realm of net art, and there's a venerable tradition that is right now by New Museum, which is now hosting Rhizome, and hosting a Rhizome exhibition that is called, I believe, Net Art. And you have a good sampling there of these forms of art that have been native to the internet going back well over a decade. So that's already there, and it's a precedent. But I think that some of the really interesting activity right now is in the trying to bring people together through conceptual means. So there is, for instance, the Concept Bank is run by an artist named Frans van Lent. And essentially, it is a series of instructions or prompts. You might think of something along the lines of what Yoko Ono was doing in the 1960s. But this is more in the realm of performance, as a matter of how you can perform one of these works for free. And it might be something that is solo, or it might be something with others, and it might be something with others performed at a distance. And this sort of improvised space where ideas can come and be experienced and can provide means for people to experience together live the making of art, the creation of art together. It's I think a really exciting thing. There's also a new site that is on Instagram called Spatial Intimacy, which is entering into the space as well, trying to figure out how do you create a sense of spatial intimacy in a where social distancing is the reality. These necessarily the sorts of art forms that are monetizable. I made it one. It is, however, out of a sense of urgency that artists are volunteering and making this work possible. And I think that this is going to have a long-term effect. I hope that it will, in terms of the fact that we're basically suturing together a society where people can't be in the same place as on the front line. And there's no mechanism for compensation. This is, as mentioned earlier, sort of a New Deal moment. And I think that integral to whatever sort of New Deal comes out of this, internalizing that artists are so central to the operation of society, that art is a public service, and that artists should be like public servants, like senators. They should be compensated, and we need a support structure that doesn't depend on the commodity system that has been the mainstay of art for.
I mean, here we have art completely caught up in this conversation about the future of capitalism, externalities, providing value and being compensated. And of course, one of the things that's going to come up, and in fact did come up this week, is as there's this giant federal bailout or assistance, how do the arts fit in that? But you and I are also familiar with another project that seems very prescient now. Gray Area did a collaboration this year with an experimental research space that resulted in a show called The End of You. It's timely for a few, and Waleed will start that in a moment, but not yet. Timely for a few things. First of all, we were focused on place-based immersive media, in the idea that in this distracted Instagram world, it was more important than ever for people to be together, experience things together, perhaps experience the spiritual dimensions, the narrative dimension of arts together. Now, when I bring this up, it almost feels like a different world because we're not supposed to be together. But one of the key points about that is we were funded by the Knight Foundation, and the idea was could this model of people coming together, could you sell tickets to that and drinks for that, and therefore split the revenues with artists, essentially bringing a performance model to the arts? And in fact, when Gray Area did this, we took 11 unknown artists, and they were able to make some money at it. The other reason is the topic of what it was about. So, I mean, let me just see if I can put this screen up here and see if you can pick this up on full screen. Jonathan, you were one of the key artists and all that, and that's actually where we left. The idea behind this show was we wanted to explore this kind of spiritual change of how humanity was going from just human-centric to the realization that we were part of greater systems. We were part of scale, from the nano to the universal. We were part of biological systems. This is a show that just ended. I'll just read you the description of it, because what it means in this environment just sounds much more different than what was written 3 weeks ago. What are the boundaries of self? The human body is composed of and animated by a vast consortium of organisms. Our cities both affront and absorb the landscape. The effect of our actions extend into the geological time and outer space. Despite this, we view humanity as separate from nature instead of a part of a greater living system. If everything is entangled from the micro to the macroeconomy, how can we rethink our relationship with the living world? The show invites you to expand our perceptions of self. What might happen when we stop seeing ourselves as individuals, acting in isolation to experience the world as a nested expression of the whole? I mean, it was essentially an invitation to understand we were part of a bigger, more complex biological system. And in fact, one of the things that people were engaged in here was a giant game of life. This is a game that came out in the 70s, early in computing, when you created an immersive life system with complexity, and based on how you interacted with it, organisms lived or died. It did kind of point out to us, Jonathan, that we're part of a bigger system here. And I think what was interesting about this is a case of artists beginning to think through where we began this conversation with Alexander. What does it mean to live in a world of interaction and complexity, of global connectedness? And this show kind of took us from what we called almost human exceptionalism, just you. We called it the end of you because it was also the beginning of we, but also because we understood we were part of a greater system. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your experience in working with some of the artists, and that is an example of how a collaboration of artists can help us anticipate where our world is headed.
What I would like to do is to respond to what you said a moment ago, and that I think came up as through your reading of the description, is how much resonance that exhibition has been. And I was there, and there was no time, so we didn't know about this. And if we had, we would have told everybody, I would hope, and done something about it. But I think that the key point is that art takes on new relevance as times change and as circumstances change. And the artist often the one who had any role in the work. The artist doesn't necessarily control the work after it's out in the world. And it is really an important point here in terms of thinking about how, by way of a pandemic, to recognize the degree to which humans are a superorganism. And that really central theme of the exhibition, which I think the exhibition potentially, in retro, those who went to the exhibition in retrospect can reflect on some of those themes in terms of these current circumstances, and perhaps more profoundly address the present moment of this present moment as being a transformative one. That is to say that we are in a time that is extraordinarily hard on people and that is fraught with tragedy, but also one that has enormous opportunity in many ways. One of which I think is this reorganization of thought, this reorganization of society potentially through a recognition of our interconnectedness. And
Okay.
in a way, I think the exhibition provides a template for that.
This has been great, and this whole art conversation has created a huge amount of conversation out there. Steve Sachs talks to us about the fact that a number of his artists are kind of working in this space. Nan Braun talks about, is this a return to patronage, spirituality in art? Liza Cowan jumps in and points out that the snobbery of art doesn't translate into this very well. But I think if we could bring our panel back as we start to wrap up here, I think, Alexander, one of the very interesting things about this is we began the conversation today talking about complexity in systems, and how do we bring that abstract or that exponential into the world? In the middle of the conversation, we talked a little bit about art and science and behavior change. And then as we looked at the world of the arts, here we had a show that was essentially about the exponential and about this becoming part of a bigger biological system. And as we were in the middle of it, we didn't even realize exactly that we were telling a story that a few weeks later would be something very different. I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but it just strikes me that it bookends it very well. And I know you're doing work at the Long Now with Jonathan and in the arts, similarly looking at how artists can help us understand these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally art is the place where it's one of the best places for civilization to boil down the science, the politics, the policy into something that can be reflected in a great way. I mean, and especially for these long interval events, for instance, I think it's totally odd that there's not a really amazing piece of art, sculptural art in San Francisco that is not warning about the earthquake danger in San Francisco. I've thought it would be great to have a set of basically of bells, a statue that would ring in different Richter scales. The different bells would ring in different Richter scales of earthquakes. That would be this kind of, it would stand there most of the time silent, but it would be this kind of warning that this could come back, and similar to these warning markers in Japan. But I wonder if there shouldn't be similar things for pandemics. And in England, there's the Tower of the Fire, or in London, the Tower of the Fire, which is now kind of buried in the middle of downtown. But as you go there, you realize that everything was burned from inside of this 400-foot tower, and it becomes this visceral, real thing. And I think we have an opportunity in art to take things where scientists tell you things like every time you go visit the geologist, they tell you about the dangers of the earthquakes. Every time you go visit the epidemiologist, they tell you about the big dangers of the pandemics. But it's very hard to kind of really think about them. And I think art is fundamentally where we get this chance. And it's why we work on something like the 10,000-year clock is the way to synthesize all of that and to have people interpret it in mostly in their own way, but at least it creates a mirror or a reflection that they have to confront and changes that conversation.
Nicol, your work sits at the confluence of technology, of spirituality, and of art, and you and Ting both look at gaming technology, or as a way of bridging those two divides.
Yeah, so I mean, I spent 14 years in games, and I worked on really big games. So I worked on World of Warcraft China and operated that led operations for that for 6 years. And so, one of the things I think is interesting about this time period is that most of the innovation and like the quality digital and distance experiences have actually been gaming experiences. Everything else has really lagged. And I think what this period of time is going to do is it's going to make all of that stuff a lot better. It doesn't have to make it better to the cost of the physical, but because we had the physical, we really, outside of gaming, just really never put enough love into our digital and distance platforms. I was talking to a friend of mine, and what they're doing with their kids, or what the school district is doing, is having the kids sit in front of Google Hangouts starting at 7:45 a.m. and ending when the school, like they're mimicking exactly what they did in reality, as opposed to saying, during this time period, you guys, get as far as you can.
Yeah.
Yeah, get as far as you can.
Why would we do crowd Nicol, which is what kind of the 30-room classroom is. When our brains are so alive, right? We love desirable difficulties. That's what games are.
Yeah,
and
they could
our
have.
kids are able to learn from what we're doing at home right now. The second,
Yeah, I mean,
and
they could have also said, run as fast as you can. So for the kids who want to run fast, if you're a sixth grader and you want to graduate from ninth grade by time the pandemic's over, if you can pass the test, you can do it. It's like, so there's that sort of thing. And what I just want to end with is that, to me, games, and this goes back to what I talked about earlier about behavior change, and what we call it. Games are actually play, exploration, community, and narrative. That story is really important. And so, Jonathan, when I was describing the frontliners at the beginning, I hadn't added the artists yet. And I think and I so appreciate you being on this call because, I think it is healthcare practitioners, government, the support services. And I also think it's the artist, because I do believe, with these threads from behavior change and, redefining digital and what the digital New Deal looks like. There is something about, we better be really clear about what we call it, because that narrative is really going to shape how we respond to it. So I'm so grateful that you were here for this call.
We're really describing kind of this classic stuff that Marshall McLuhan describes when we put new media to old uses, which we're doing.
Yeah, there's this traditional use of media, and I think what's interesting is artists always push the traditional. If you look at the Crystal Palace in the 1800s, was this beautiful thing that was actually produced in a very expressive way. But if you went inside of it, what you found at this World's Fair, this World Exhibition on Manufacturing, were a bunch of Chippendale pieces of cast bronze with belts that were driven by things. And so it was like all the Industrial Revolution stuff was ancient, but the stuff on the building itself was actually kind of expressive and new. I wanted to mention something related to what Nicol said about games. Games, when we talk about even what we're Ting and the Center for Advanced Hindsight and B-Works, which is one of their sister organizations up in Toronto, what they do often is they look at motivation and behavior and habit. And sometimes everyone tries to attack the motivation side, but really building new habits is hard. Somebody once told me that a bad habit's easy to make and hard to live with. And a good habit is hard to make and easy to live with. And I think games turn out to be a powerful way to do this, because you get to be in a visceral environment. And they've done some amazing games that actually, if you play it a few times and you're a villager in Kenya and you're a mom and you're playing this board game, you actually end up playing out something in a very visceral way. You feel it and you learn something from the visceralness of the game about how you invest your money. Do you spend the money here? Do you spend the money there? And they were able to measure a reduction in myopia, a reduction in bad long-term thinking by playing the game a few times, because it's very visceral. You feel like you're trying to level up, you're trying to get more points and things like that. And so play, all organisms play in some ways. You can find actually rock, paper, scissors playing within bacteria, within gut organisms. And you'll actually see these games. And play is desirable difficulties or productive struggle. And productive struggle is when we bind neurons together faster than ever. And so play is one of those things where I would rather see Minecraft than people implementing a classroom in Zoom from 8 a.m. till 3 p.m. It's backwards. So Ting, I'm not sure if you're feeling okay to expand on this, but I would recommend everybody take a look at what Duke Center for Advanced Hindsight is doing, and take a look at some of the other things. I think there's something beautiful happening here where we bring behavioral science and play and actually help us close the gap between motivation and behavior.
I would like to suggest that what we're about to do, I want everyone to stick around. We're about to end this, and then we're going to come back, and in overtime, we've learned that it's time-based now. Anna will join us, and we're going to talk a lot about what the audience our participants have been talking about. I think one of the things that's been amazing about this hour is we said we wanted to spend this time thinking about the tension between short and long-term thinking. And that tension came up really this week as people are like, maybe all we have to do is focus on the immediacy of crisis response and building personal protective gear. And at the same time, people are asking, as Nicol is, how do we plan for what's next? One of the things that comes out of this is that, okay, our world is in a phase change now. We really are in this connected exponential. The example we all used until this week was climate change, but here is pandemic and connectedness. And it does seem that a bit of the way out, or the way to understand, is to understand these precepts of long-term thinking, of systems thinking. Many of these ideas, of course, came up in the 1950s and 1960s. We're really revisiting Buckminster Fuller here, or E.F. Shoemaker, and or even Marshall McLuhan, many of these ideas. And this, I think, suggests really interesting explorations for some of our next shows and our next explorations. I want to tease next week's show. We'll be on twice next week, Wednesday and Friday. Wednesday's show is going to take a deep dive on telemedicine. How has that whole world as a media form been responding? And we're thrilled to have join us Susan Denser, who runs one of the nation's top research centers on this, and also was the PBS correspondent for health and medicine for many, many years. Next week, we're also going to get into the practicalities of how were people designing quarantines and actually building systems for support that we're going to have to learn from. And then later on in the week, we're going to revisit the arts in greater depth. We're going to take a look at this gray area show that I discussed, and we're going to visit some of the Burning Man camps, because Burning Man is it's an independent organization, and each camp is like its own tribe, and all of those are autonomously behaving in very interesting ways now. And so we're going to take a look at some of that as we continue on this path of art and science. Again, the whole purpose of this exploration is to connect, be a bit of a campfire for these conversations. On our site are links to all of the resources that we've talked about today. And I want to thank our amazing team, our key technical consultant, Mohib, who has put together a lot of the back end. Omid, who is our key producer, he's switching the show from one location. I'm here. Anna, who's managing the project and community. Mickey and I, well, I'll thank myself, it's fine, but Mickey, only Trump would thank himself. But Mickey, I want to thank you for all the great work that you're doing in helping putting this together. This is Quarantime. It's an experiment. Oh, and I also want to thank Drew Youngs, our musical director. As we go out with the credits today, the sound will be on, and we may pop up over the weekend with Drew and do Quarantine Weekend Edition, which will be more of a late night experiment. So thank you for coming. And Omid, please take us out with the Quarantine song.
So close, quarantine. You can share from a distance, quarantine. You know we want to.
We're going to take that from the top, because you can't hear a song without sound in half of it. So, Omid, can we take that from the top? And it's always possible that, okay.
Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk. Fade,
Okay, well, we're back for overtime. I want to point out what just happened there is exactly what's happening to the supply chain of N95 masks and ventilators. You see, if you're going to do a distributed show like this, you need resilience. You can't assume that one point is the one point that if it fails, it's going to work great, because the internet is screwy all over the place. So what Omid and I knew was that we ought to have all the media we're using backed up in 3 places. So if anyone's media or internet crapped out, it would be fine. We knew that, but we didn't plan for that. So that just goes to show that all this stuff we talked about is true, even with this. Okay, everybody come back. And Anna, why don't you join us? And we're going to do overtime here. Hi, Anna. Anna is our community manager. Okay. And Anna, I'm going to throw it to you because you have been paying attention to what everybody's been saying. And I've just been glancing in and out. So perhaps you can share some of the questions. And I see there's a big bar over my face, so I'll get out of the way and we can talk to the panel and hear what people have to say.
Good. Thanks, everyone. So the topics today were very broad and vast, and of course the questions reflect that. One of the things that, of course, you know, in the context of Team Now and Team Next, I'm hearing is that, you know, our audience, represented by Mark Petrakis, wants some links to resources that can help people today, all caps today, and gathered from our audience here now. And I think that the same is holds true for you know, what's next. So like what resources can we gather and provide about coming out of this crisis? So like that's something for you guys to answer here, but also something that we on the show are putting together in form of a website. We'll share these things via social media, things like that. And of course, it will include you know, everything that our guests share with us as we have these interactions. But what do you guys say?
Like what people do today?
Yeah, basically in terms of resources, especially for you, Nicol, in terms of resources for what we can do today, what are kind of your favorite go-tos that people who are concerned about the crisis can use?
Well, I mean, it's sort of like the first part is people deciding or just evaluating their own skill sets and deciding if they're on Team Now or Team Next. If you're on Team Now, there's the COVID hackathon. Like there's so many amazing programs and projects that people are doing for all skill sets that are out there. So I'll send you a couple of things, but there's just amazing things that are out there. And then for, you know, coordination around Team Next, that's really just starting to get started. And it's conversations like this, people who are systemic thinkers like Joe Edelman is starting to do some things. And there isn't really a platform yet where I've seen a lot of like lots of things are popping up in different places, but I haven't seen, you know, the same level of cohesion around places to be about what's next. The Presidency Institute is starting to do some what's next stuff. And I think their next class, they had 1,000 seats and now they're going to have over 5,000 people in it. So amazing. Yeah. And so I think that part's just beginning because we've all, you know, it's like that HBR article that came out that said what you're feeling is grief.
I think,
you know, what you're experiencing right now is grief. The grief over what we thought was going to happen with our lives and the fact that it's going to be very different.
Yeah.
I want to bring up this resource thing. You know, one of the inspirations for all of this started with the distance resistance group, which, you know, is sitting there literally thinking. That was the one I turned to yesterday to figure out, well, should I go out? And people are talking about how to handle these things. That then led to 2 weeks ago, this creation of of quarantines, and that we talked about that last time. That's a group that has brought together kind of tech and social media leaders around the world that came up with this Stay Home, Save Lives mechanism. And that's actually at quarantinenow.com. And they're preparing now, well, what are some of the best practices for teams and for social support and stuff? But one of the other questions here is, Alexander, we're all connected to these global innovation networks. There's yours at Long Now, there's the Aspen Institute, there's TED, all these Burning Man groups. And it strikes me that all at once, all of these different networks that are doing their own thing are suddenly racing towards kind of things to do, projects to work on. And this is almost a moment where we have to build synapses between all of these. And also like a big flood. It's like a big flat file system flood. We used to have the friction that I could only go to your event on Thursday or fly to New York for something. But now it's all in an email and a Twitter feed. And so, you run one of these global innovation networks and you have some of the most connected people in the world. So thoughts on both how people are organizing for all of this and also, Nicol and Alexander, how we sort through all this.
And one thing.
Let Alexander get back.
Oh, I'm sorry, Alexander. I didn't mean to steal your thunder.
Go ahead.
No worries. Well, I mean, I think, now we're in the great experimentation phase, and nobody knows really what works. And, there's, people are jumping onto the first platforms that they used before, like Zoom, but they're fundamentally, likely not going to be the best platforms for what we really want to do. But they're certainly a good bridge. And I think without a lot of these tools and without the internet, this would be the isolation would be vastly more disturbing than it is now. So I think what we need to do is get broad, and then as we do that and find those experimentations, is really then we start looking and seeing which ones work, how to connect them. Forums like this are a great start. I'm part of a group of executive directors of similar organizations to Long Now, like Internet Archive and EFF and Wikimedia, that are kind of similar in scale and reach and constituencies. And we typically would get together for real live dinners every once in a while, which was fantastic. But now we're getting together online and just sharing the human resource stories and how each one of the institutions is communicating their networks. So those connections are going to be vital. I don't think there's not a right answer at all right now. I think but I think what there is right now is a massive amount of really great permission, and that you can do things, you can try things out with that. The level of institution, the level of production that we would demand of ourselves for an online presentation, we are dropping way down in order to just get it out there and to start and to just really start connecting with people, because people realize you're in your living room and your cat might walk across your lap in the middle of your talk, and your kid might scream, and all the kids are home and the cats are, the house pets are probably the biggest winner of this whole thing, and they're home with us, so they're part of our lives. And I've seen some great innovations, like people hiring local performers that are totally out of work to just do a 10-minute little performance before their Zoom meeting, even in front of a corporate meeting. And it's like you have someone sing a couple songs, and it changes the vibe of it. It changes everything. And so I think we're going to be seeing more and more of those experiments, or we're going to hopefully be able to aggregate the ones that work and go with those.
Yeah, I did a thing the other day with a friend of mine who's a DJ who's sheltering in place in the Bahamas. And he would play a song, ask me a question, play a song. And it was really a lot of fun. I was like, awesome.
Anna, you're about to say something.
Yeah, well, aside from this amazing kind of array of things that we can experiment with and people do experiment with, and it is really fun, and not also as dire as we expected this particular crisis to be, at least not yet. And aside from the government kind of bailout to the people, which is also kind of fresh, a bunch of my friends, I wanted to kind of call this out and give them a shout out, are creating this created the safety net fund for artists specifically in Oakland. They're raising $500,000, and they're far more than halfway to their goal right now. And there's just news for this particular fund that there's an anonymous individual donation of $54,000 which somebody just dropped into this fund to support local artists. I think that's incredible. And maybe other locations that I don't know about are having a similar experiment running. And so it's things like this that I want to kind of put into this resource that we can share with our community, and kind of combine other communities' resources as well, and spread the word.
Safety net is already paying out grants. They were paying out grants like almost within days of opening, and which is unheard of, obviously, in normal grant-making institutions. So they've been doing fantastic work here in the Bay Area, and I think they're great.
Very lean UX. And by the way, the name of the safety net fund is the website is safetynetfund.io.
Taking up a point that Xander made a moment ago, which I think is quite interesting to explore, is the fact that this permission that we now have to do things that would never have been thinkable otherwise, in a sense, we are able to dispense with a lot of the legacy of the internet. And that is to say that, in a sense, we're able to do things in ways that are far less technologically savvy, and as a result to kind of have a parallel universe at the moment where a lot of possibilities that simply as a matter of one thing leading to another never came up and never were feasible, that they become feasible now. We can do things in a very low-tech way that would have been appropriate 10 years ago or 15 years ago with all the knowledge that we've accumulated over those 10 or 15 years. And that can allow us, I think, to rethink going forward what we want the web to be, what we want the internet to be, and what we want human interaction to be within the context of these various tools.
This is, we think we've been through a social media era, and then all of a sudden this happens, and we're staring at a bunch of tools and trying to get the DNA of the best of them and remake them. And if we think back in history, the social media era really emerged out of the ashes of the internet crash of 2000, right? So you had, you had websites, and then all of a sudden, people had actually time to work on things because there was a crash, and then there was experimentation, and what came next was the social media era. We're like going through that in a week, and we're seeing it both with all this experimentation, but also to this permission point that Alexander made. It's also because of either real world institutional failures or, lack of resilience that we're kind of hooking up both the internet capacity, the bits to atoms, the maker capacity in responding, right? And this is and we know that these tools can empower us, and in a way, we're trying to figure out how high we can get that power in this time of need, which is why we see autonomous release organizations, autonomous production of kind of things, all of these groups hooking up, right? This is evolution, but really fast. And that's what I find is the most encouraging thing about this moment. And I think the reason we put all of this together, because there's so much stuff going on, it's like, how can you look over the shoulder of everybody and get a sense for it?
Well, I think to Jonathan's point, there's also even older technologies in the supply chain sector that I think are really hopefully going to be re-looked at. And you look at things like the way we've cornered ourselves in the medical industry into 100% of things being one-time use and disposable, when almost it used to be that all these devices that we used in a doctor's office would go into an autoclave, be cleaned, gowns would be washed, shields would be, goggles and shields would be cleaned off and sterilized. And that whole, those devices can't even be used that way now because they're all designed to be one-time use. But I suspect and I hope that there's going to be a resurgence in actually looking at things that, if a hospital was able to just throw their stuff in the laundry, their gallons in the laundry, and get them back up onto the floors right now, I think they would be vastly happier than, you know, hoping that somebody ships them a box that they don't know how many there are on the shelf somewhere.
Right, which gets back to so many of these, much of the early precept of the maker movement about repair and not the black box of a supply chain. It's interesting, just throw another Burning Man shout out there. Burning Man often thinks of itself as a permission engine, right? Because the whole idea is everyone has permission to go create something. And that's a little bit of the behavior, here. We're probably beginning to come up on the end here because I think we've gone about 50 minutes over. This is terrific. I think we're all going to have to continue this. And as I mentioned, on Wednesday, we're going to be coming up on one on telehealth. As we wrap this out, since everyone here is working on interesting virtual stuff, maybe just some shout outs of things that are coming up. Alexander, what's coming up from the long now that we can connect with? I think you were mentioning that Jane Metcalf had something coming up. You're on mute. Either you're on mute because I put you on mute.
Right.
You're back. You're back. Good.
Yes. Sorry, yes. Jane Metcalf on the neobiological revolution is going to be coming up, and I think she's already. We've been talking about how she's going to retune her talk in the present moment to, you know, as we likely some of the longest term solutions that we see around something like pandemics are going to come out of that revolution. So I think it'll be interesting. Stay tuned. Anyone on Long Now feeds will be publishing the date and the methodology of that very shortly, but it'll be in mid-April.
And our first show, which I guess was a week ago today, focused a lot on synthetic biology with Andrew Hessel. Same kind of concept, which is we ought to be able to gear up to go from spotting a new virus, understanding its genome, and doing something about it a lot faster than we are now. That's the promise. And Andrew also pointed out last week that the digital virus probably arrived here before the virus. That China had taken apart the genome, and we had seen it, but could not really respond fast enough before it actually showed up in force. Jonathan, in the world of the arts, you are our guide to, and you might want to point us at your Forbes resource, which Anna we can share, but also what are some of the things that people can look at that are both time-based coming up and in general that you can point us to? Now you're going to have to unmute also. Welcome back.
Thank you. So I'm currently working on a large-scale and long-term project that is recalibrating society by using time standards based on natural systems. And one dimension of this is working with Long Now, where we're going to enlist bristlecone pine trees. But in the more immediate future, I'm working with the Anchorage Museum, enlisting rivers and the rate at which rivers flow as a basis for calibrating the flow of time and thereby bringing us into a new relationship with natural systems and with the ways in which the changes in those systems are registered in terms of the changes in our everyday lives, and new feedback loops can be created. What's been interesting about this is that it was very much about thinking in the long term and creating these long-term relationships between us and the environment, but it's become also very much a project about the current conditions of our world for several reasons, one of which is that we have to start sometime. And in the case of Anchorage and these rivers, we're starting now. And I think that that means that we're starting with a baseline. Basically, we're calibrating the clock based on the flow of rivers right now, which means that we're looking at a world where, in a lot of ways, we're in a better place than we've been in a long time as a result of the decrease in air travel and various other ways in which the environment is in a better place. Can we thereby, through mechanisms ranging from the arts to the sciences, use this new baseline as a basis for then establishing more aspirationally what we want of and from the environment going forward? So it's taken on that sort of meaning, as well as a possibility for people to calibrate their lives in relation to one another on river time, and to create, and in this very grounded way, even where they're not able to get out, new relationships that might allow for a sense of being in place together. So my own work definitely has taken a coronavirus sort of turn. I'm also continuing on Forbes to write about this and to look at all the various places within the art world and all the various art forms that are taking this up. In particular, looking at, so without the permission of institutions, occasionally with a little bit of support from those institutions.
I love how this term permission keeps coming up. Nicol, we're wrapping up. Where shall we address our attention through your lens?
Well, so one of the things that we're doing is we're going to have an online demo day on the 21st of April, and it's going to be just product after product that you can use today for stress, anxiety, depression, happiness, emotional enhancement, just basically our whole thing. So I'm like going through companies, and what we'll do is anyone who comes, they'll get a discount or a free trial. It'll be a place where you could just see everything all in one place that can help you. So it'll be like an online bazaar. I have to come up with a good name for it. And so that'll be really cool, because all of the companies want to provide things. And many people think that the only options that they have out there are a Headspace or a Calm, when there's actually so many different types of things that you can use to support you in this time period. So that's how our community is going to create a resource that people can use. And so that's the next big thing.
You know, oddly, it's like there's all of this abundance in the middle of this disaster, right? We keep talking about abundance, it's a concept, but you can see where people are putting their cognitive surplus and their time, and it's very, you know, and I forget who made this point before, but it's very tough for institutions to change quickly. You know, just as it's very tough for a bank to respond to something new, or it's very tough for a hotel to respond to Airbnb. This is an amazing moment for lean entities that can move quickly and adapt, because it does have everybody on the same page, right? You know, there's clear vision right now.
I have one wish. I have one wish. I wish that there was a network map between all of the what's next players, so that we could really see what everyone was doing, and not like, it's such a foolish time to recreate the wheel. It's such a foolish time to, to have a dozen organizations doing the exact same thing. It really seems like this would be the right time for new forms of collaboration. And I wish that there was a way, like a data visualization way, so that everyone who's working on what's next can find one another.
And I want I want this map to exist for all critical topics: climate change, housing crisis, homelessness, healthcare, right? We need this exact kind of thing. And I know that there are people working on it, but I haven't seen anything aside from, Wikipedia.
The Quarantine Now group, I know, is doing a map that should be up next week of all sorts of people who are responding, I think, more to the now challenge, right? Because there's so many response organizations. On some level, Alexander, the next, connecting up everybody who's working on Next was not too far off from the original visions of the web, right? I mean, you go back to Vannevar Bush trying to
totally.
Right, and then the web kind of kept things up. So it's like we have the stuff, but there is like so much stuff going on. There's probably other approaches, but that's a little bit like the question I asked you of all these innovation networks, right? Because everyone in your network has its networks, and Aspen has its. Maybe we could just wrap up on that, right? Because
I think if you want to get right down to it, the DARPA net was originally created as a decentralized network for communications after a nuclear holocaust. So it was, the original internet intent was really to solve a problem exactly like the one we're in. We're not a nuclear holocaust, obviously, but we're in a time of high separation. And so this is kind of that moment that it was designed for, and and all this other stuff that we've kind of been doing with it in between is been a different kind of playing around, and so in some ways it's coming into its own, and I think we're going to see some of the greatest innovation in this space that we have seen in a long time, and hopefully stuff that's not just about how to click on ads, but how to actually make civilization better.
Yeah.
As
perfect ending.
Right, and as we go out right now, I thought that as I would take us out, I would take us out to this gentleman who we will leave on the screen. Let's see if this works. Here's the well, there we go. Now I have to do this. I would like to let's see. Can I do this? This is okay. So basically, Omid has gone home, and so I'm left to myself. Let's try this. We have that, and now we'll just go to this image here. I'm attempting to bring up an image of Buckminster Fuller, who I believe is our patron saint for this moment. Are we looking at him, or should I just do that next time? Okay,
we're looking at it.
You're actually looking at Marshall McLuhan. All right. So in that case,
right now it's the box square.
Huh?
Right now, you're good. Now you're on. This is Marshall McLuhan.
Right. Let's. Okay. Well, clearly we have a little bit to learn technology-wise here, but in that case, in that case, perhaps we can let Marshall McLuhan take us out if I can figure out how to do this. Anna, you say something while I finish this thing up.
Well, I think will really span the gamut of so many topics, right? Like from art. One thing that I'm curious about is how does the audience mentioned that you can't really separate spirituality from art, and that was a very pertinent part of the conversation. But she says, I am interested in how we will meld technology and a new type of connectedness into this art spirituality mix. So that's like kind of a deeper question that is fun to ponder.
I have made an executive decision I think when we come back on the next show, we're going to show you this video of Marshall McLuhan. I'm not going to fool with it anymore. I'm going to tell everybody, thank you very much. Stay safe. Let's go have dinner. And we'll have a lot of quarantine between now and when this ends. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.